So I'm going to speak to you today about a study titled Data Impacts of Changes in Census Bureau Procedures for Race and Ethnicity Data. So the presentation is based on a research study that I conducted with colleagues, Professors Carolyn Liebler of the University of Minnesota, Mark Garcia of Syracuse University, and Rogelio Saenz of the University of Texas at San Antonio. And I do need to note that the findings and conclusions of our study are those of the authors and not necessarily represent the official position of the National Center for Health Statistics. So I'll start with something that you may have already seen. The U.S. Census Bureau reported unprecedented increases in the multiracial and some other race populations between 2010 and 2020 decennial censuses. The multiracial population increased by 276%. The some other race in combination with another race increased by 733%. The white population in combination with another race increased by 316%. And the American Indian and Alaska Native population in combination with another race group increased by 160%. The Hispanic population was especially affected by these changes. For example, the Hispanic multiracial population increased by 567%, while the Hispanic white alone population declined by 53%. And the Hispanic American Indian and Alaska Native population increased by 115%. We also see large increases among the non-Hispanic population by race, with a large increase of almost 180% for the some other race and 127% increase for the population two or more races or multiracial. The U.S. Census Bureau reports that the changes are results of, quote, improvements to the design of the two separate questions for race and ethnicity, data processing and coding, which enabled a more thorough and accurate depiction of how people prefer to self-identify, end quote. However, we have found that the changes were not improvements in how people prefer to self-identify, but instead made the pre-2020 and 2020 and post-2020 census data incomparable for U.S. racial and ethnic populations, particularly the Hispanic population and the American Indian and Alaska Native population. More importantly, we argue that these changes have impacted other data systems that rely on census data to produce reliable demographic, socioeconomic, health statistics by race and ethnicity. So in our study, we explore the impact of the U.S. Census Bureau's 2020 revisions to the race and ethnicity questions, processing rules, and coding strategy on Hispanic and American Indian and Alaska Native populations. First, we explore changes in the reported racial composition of the overall Hispanic population and by country of origin, and the racial and ethnic composition of the American Indian Alaska Native population between 2019 and 2021. Second, we explore the effects of these changes on select demographic and socioeconomic characteristics of the Hispanic racial populations. And third, we explore the effects of the changes in the reported racial composition of the two populations on U.S. mortality estimates. Finally, we discuss the potential impact of these changes on the evaluation studies of the quality of race and Hispanic origin reporting on death certificates. We use the American Community Survey rather than the 2010 and 2020 decennial censuses in order to mitigate the potential impact of real demographic and sociocultural changes that could explain the differences we observe. Changes of the magnitude observed in population, racial, and ethnic composition within a very short period, like 2 years, are less likely to be due to true demographic processes like births, deaths, net migration, or changes in sociocultural processes like racial and ethnic self-identification over a decade. Importantly, the race and ethnicity questions, processing and coding rules used in the American Community Survey are identical to those used in the decennial censuses. For example, the 2019 ACS race and ethnicity questions mirror the 2010 decennial census race and ethnicity questions. Similarly, the 2021 ACS race and ethnicity questions mirror the 2020 decennial questions. So I'll give you a short, brief history of federal standards for the collection and reporting of race and ethnicity data. So in 1977, the Office of Management and Budget issued Statistical Policy Directive number 15, Race and Ethnicity Standards for Federal Statistics and Administrative Reporting, to standardize race and ethnicity data across all federal agencies. This is the first time such a standard is implemented. The standard called for 2 separate questions. One question referred to ethnicity, and the other question referred to race. Ethnicity is just a 2-item question. The respondent is of Hispanic origin, or the Hispanic is not of Hispanic origin. The race question had 4 categories: American Indian or Alaska Native, Asian or Pacific Islander, Black, and white. In 1997, the Office of Management and Budget revised the 1977 standard by increasing the race categories to 5, basically by breaking up the Asian and Pacific Islander to 2 groups, Asian and separately Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander, and also by adding the option to select more than 1 race. The Hispanic origin question remained unchanged. The Hispanic origin or persons of Hispanic origin were defined as persons of Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Central or South American, or other Spanish culture or origin, regardless of race. In other words, Hispanic people can be of any race. The race categories were defined as American Indian or Alaska Native persons have origins in any of the original peoples of North and South America, including Central America, and who maintain tribal affiliation or community attachment. Asian persons were described as having origins in any of the original peoples of the Far East, Southeast Asia, or the Indian subcontinent, including Cambodia, China, India, Japan, Korea, for example. Black or African American persons were defined as persons having origins in any of the Black racial groups of Africa, and terms such as Haitian or Negro were acceptable in addition to Black or African American. Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander were persons having origins in any of the original peoples of Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, or other Pacific Islands. And finally, white persons were defined as those having origins in any of the original peoples of Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. Now, in March 28th, 2024, just this year, the Office of Management and Budget published revisions to the Statistical Policy Directive number 15 with the goal of implementation across the federal government within the next 5 years. The revised standard combines the Hispanic origin and the race questions into 1 question and separates out as a category Middle Eastern and North African as its own category, separate from what it currently is, which is part of the white category. Now, I won't be talking about this new revision because it's not been implemented yet. So most of what I talk about is based on the 1997 revision. Now, first, I talk about the changes to the Hispanic origin question between 2010 and 2020 decennial censuses. And we see that there was hardly any change. The questions are almost identical. The only difference is that in 2010, the instruction to print origin in the write-in box under another Hispanic or Latino or Spanish origin that is not one of the ones above, to please write it down. We're giving examples of country of origin, and that is changed to the word just print in 2020. And the list of examples is also different, but the change is not dramatic. Now, with respect to the race question, we do see large and very important changes. So in the 2010 census race question, also very similar to the previous 2000 question, persons or respondents are asked to check one or more of the race boxes. So you can check white, Black, American Indian, one of the Asian subcategories, or one of the Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander subcategories. And for the American Indian and Alaska Native, there's a write-in box with instructions to write tribe, for example. And for the Asian group, there's a write-in box to write in Asian group or Asian country of origin that's not one of the ones that has its own box. Similarly, for the other Pacific Islander, write in the group that's not already that already has a check-in box. And then interesting, there's a category that's some other race. Now, this category is not part of the OMB directive, but it is a congressional mandate that requires the Census Bureau to include some other race category that respondents can select if they don't feel that any of the standard categories apply to them. So, and it also has a write-in box, so respondents can define whatever that other race is for them. Excuse me. Now in 2020, we see two big changes. One is that a write-in box is added to the white category and to the Black category. Instructions are added that state respondents should print origins in addition to checking one or more of the race boxes. And the examples given for origins appear to be country of origin. For example, German, Irish, English, Italian. Similarly for the Black population, African American, Jamaican, Haitian. The American Indian category remains similar to the previous decennial census. We have a write-in box for tribe names. There's the addition of the Mayan and Aztec as examples. Well, actually, I should mention that there is a difference in that examples are given this time for that group as well. For the Asian groups, very similar. Again, there's a write-in box for the other Asian and other Pacific Islander groups that don't have their own check boxes. And again, there's a some other race category, a checkbox for that, and also the option to write in a race. And again, respondents are asked to, in addition to printing their race, they should print an origin. Now, there were important changes to the Hispanic origin and race data processing and coding rules beginning with the 2020 Decennial and American Community Survey. And there are three important ones. The first being that the number of characters captured from the write-in boxes was increased from 30 to 200. So by increasing characters captured, a person's long list of ancestries could be included. The second was using one single code list for coding data from both Hispanic origin and race write-in boxes, instead of two coding lists, one for ethnicity and one for race. So each of the responses in write-in boxes are then individually coded into a race or ethnicity category from the single code list. The most important or consequential of the changes in coding rules is the third one that we list here, and that is that any response in the write-in boxes in the race question that refer to Hispanic or Latino origin, like Spaniard, Cuban, Mexican, Argentinian, Dominican, is coded to some other race. So for example, if I go back here and a person who in the previous question responded yes, Hispanic, and clicked yes, Cuban, and then in the race question, they selected Black here, but then in the write-in box, they wrote down Cuban because the examples given are, and they're being prompted to put down what they think to be a country of origin, so they write down Cuban. They don't select any other race category, including some other race. They don't select some other race, they just select Black. What happens to this person is that the Cuban origin that they write down in the write-in box is coded to some other race. So the person is then tabulated as Black and some other race, and then becomes a multiracial person. So in the past, in 2010, for example, that Hispanic Cuban person would have just been, in terms of race, Black or Black alone. But now in 2020, that person is Black and some other race. Now, the rationale for these this particular change that the Census Bureau provides is, quote, Hispanic responses to the race question are tabulated as part of the some other race category, as Hispanic or Latino is not considered a race in the 1997 OMB standards, end quote. So this explanation we find to be incongruent with the definition provided by OMB. If Hispanic or Latino is not considered a race, then how can it be classified as some other race, which is a race category? So an example would be that the same rule would be applied to someone who identifies as American, because let's say they're born in the United States, but then they choose one race, they choose Black, but they write down American in the write-in box, so then they would be coded as Black and some other race, in other words, biracial. So it's the same idea. Now, next, I'll show you what we found in terms of the impact on the size and composition of the Hispanic and American Indian or Alaska Native populations by comparing this particular slide shows the distribution of race classification in the Hispanic population since 1980. The years circled in red are the decennial censuses. The 1980 census was the first census that included the Hispanic origin question, which was as a result of the 1977 OMB standard. And the 2000 census is the first to include the option to provide or to select more than one race. What this slide shows is that based on the 4 decennial censuses, 1980, 1990, 2000, and 2010, and the annual American Community Surveys for years 2006 through 2019, the racial distribution of the Hispanic population in the US remained relatively stable between these years. The percentage classified racially as white alone ranged from 58% in 1980 to 65% in 2019. But in 2021, the percentage classified as white alone was 16.4%. The percentage classified as Black alone ranged from 2.3% in 2019 to 2.7% in 1980. But in 2021, it was only 1.5%. The percentage classified racially as some other race alone ranged from 38% in 1980 to 26% in 2019. And the percentage classified as multiracial, beginning in 2000 when the question was asked, ranged from 6.3% to 5% in 2019. But in 2021, the percentage multiracial or 2 or more races grew to 44% of the Hispanic population. Now, this is a busy slide, but hopefully it conveys the impact of the changes. So this shows the percent of the Hispanic population coded as white alone, some other race alone, and white and some other race for the entire Hispanic population and by country of origin for 2019 and 2021. Now, the racial distributions by country of origin within the Hispanic population varies considerably. Hispanics descend mainly from 3 distinct founding populations of the modern Americas: Native American, European, and African. But the proportion from each origin population and degrees of admixture vary significantly across Latin American countries. And these differences are reflected in how Hispanics in the US self-identify. In 2019, the proportion classified as white alone, the yellow, ranged from a high of 89% among Argentinians to a low of 35% among Dominicans. The proportion classified as some other race alone ranged from a high of 42% among Guatemalans to a low of 5% among Cubans. But between 2019 and 2021, increases in the number of Hispanics classified as both white and some other race ranged from 403% among Panamanians to 7,476% among Cubans. So here you go from this little blue to this long blue area here. Now, this slide shows the percent of the Hispanic population coded as Black alone or in combination with white and some other race by country of origin. And we can see that the Hispanic Black or Afro-Latino population declined 35% between 2019 and 2021. In 2019, 2.3% of the Hispanics were racially classified as Black alone, but in 2021, it was only 1.5%. The proportion classified as Black alone in 2019 varied from 26% among Panamanians to just 1% among Ecuadorians. The proportions of Hispanics classified as both Black and some other race increased by 367% for the total Hispanic population. The increases in those classified as Black and some other race ranged from 103% among Nicaraguans to 1,037% among Dominicans. Now, with respect to the American Indian and Alaska Native population, this slide shows the percent change in the American Indian and Alaska Native alone population by some subgroups. So the first bars here show just the total American Indian population alone, single race. And then these show subcategories of that population. So this is the North American tribes, and that is those that in that write-in box wrote down the name for a tribe. This shows Central and South American tribes, and then this shows no tribe reported. And one of the most interesting things to note here is that among the non-Hispanic American Indian and Alaska Native population, there were declines across all the groups. So in total, the American Indian non-Hispanic population in the US declined by 21% between 2019 and 2021. Those with a listing a tribe declined by 21%. Those listing a North American tribe, those listing a Central or South American tribe declined by 58%. And those listing no tribe declined by almost 20%. In contrast, all these groups that were Hispanic or that identified as Hispanic increased dramatically. So you have the total American Indian alone population that is Hispanic increased by 143%. Those that report a North American tribe increased by over 206%. And those with no tribe increased by 124%. Now, this slide shows the same thing, changes between in the sizes of the populations between 2019 and 2021, but for American Indian multiracial populations, in other words, American Indian in combination with other race groups. So here we see, for example, the American Indian and white population increased 100%. And that was basically, to put it into clearer numbers, the population doubled to 2.8 million%. I'm sorry, to 2.8 million between 2019 and 2021. We see that the American Indian and some other race declined, but the American Indian and Black non-Hispanic increased. So did the American Indian white and Black, the American Indian white and some other race, and the total multiracial American Indian non-Hispanic population increased by 88%. Now here's something, this bar shows the increase in the American Indian and white and some other race group. That increase was 2,000, and that's for the Hispanic population, for the Hispanic American Indian population. And that was an increase of 2,244%. And putting that into the population numbers, the population grew from 25,347 in 2019 to 594,215 in 2021. Okay, so those are just a brief look at what these two populations, the composition of the two populations look like and how they changed between the 2 years. So now I want to show you a few examples of the impact on data that we use, such as mortality estimates, demographic estimates, socioeconomic estimates, how that or how those statistics were impacted by these changes. So this slide shows the percent of the Hispanic population ages 65 and older by race in 2019 and 2021. So we see that there was considerable change across most groups. The Black population that is 65 and older declined from 6.6% to 4.7% or 29%. The Black and some other race population increased 88%. The white and some other race population increased 51%. And the only group that did not change very much was Black and white and some other race. But all the groups saw dramatic changes in the proportion of people in the older age, in that older age category. And then this slide shows the percent of the Hispanic population who speak English at home by race and in 2019 and 2021. And again, this really interesting results within a 2-year period. The percentage of Hispanic persons who speak English at home changed dramatically for almost every group. So for the Black population, it went from 45% to 63%. For the white, from 31% to 48%. For the Black and some other race, it declined 53%. For the white and some other race population, it decreased 79%. So these are dramatic differences, changes in just a 2-year period. Okay, so in this slide, we start to look at the effects on mortality estimates, specifically here, age-adjusted death rates. We assess the impact of the changes in racial and ethnic population composition between 2019 and 2021 on mortality estimates by estimating age-adjusted death rates using the ACS data for our race, ethnicity, and age-specific rate denominators, and NCHS unimputed mortality race data to match the race categories from the ACS data files. The 2021 post-census population estimates used by NCHS to produce official death rates are not based directly on the 2020 decennial race, ethnicity, age-specific census counts. The post-2020 post-census estimates produced by the U.S. Census Bureau are based on what's called a blended base that applies the 2010 decennial census race, ethnicity, sex, age distributions to the 2020 decennial total census counts. As a result, these post-census estimates have not been affected by the changes resulting from the new race and ethnicity question design, data processing and coding rules, and coding procedure changes implemented by the Census Bureau in 2020. In addition, unimputed mortality data was used in order to produce death rates for the some other race population. It is standard practice to impute the some other race to one of the 5 or their combinations race groups for the production of final official mortality estimates, as well as official Census Bureau post-census estimates. What you see in this slide here, the increase in the age-adjusted death rate for the total population of 37.4% is consistent with the increases that we saw across the board during this period because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And in fact, this increase of 37% is very close to the increase of 38% that we observed when looking at the estimates based on the official, and when we look at the official NCHS estimates. In contrast, the increase of 518% for an age-adjusted death rate of 635 per 100,000 population to 3,927 is completely unbelievable. Similarly, the increase of 138% in the age-adjusted death rate for the Black Hispanic population is implausible. The large decreases in the age-adjusted death rates for the white and some other race and the Black and some other race are also unrealistic and inconsistent with the changes that we saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. Between 2019 and 2021, mortality increased for all major racial and ethnic groups for which mortality is measured. And it would be highly unlikely that mortality would have declined at all during the pandemic, especially not to this degree, and especially not within the Hispanic population who was so disproportionately affected by the pandemic. Now, this slide shows the two panels. Panel A shows official NCHS age-adjusted death rates. And recall that the 2021 post-census population estimates used by NCHS to produce the official death rates are based on that blended base that applies the 2010 decennial census race, ethnicity, sex, age distributions to the 2020 decennial total census counts. As a result, these post-census estimates have not been affected by the changes resulting from the new race and ethnicity question design, data processing and coding procedures, changes implemented by the Census Bureau in 2020. Panel B shows the same age-adjusted death rates, but estimated using the American Community Survey data for the population estimates to show the effects of the changes in the race and ethnicity data, because these were affected by those changes. The relatively large increases in mortality between 2019 and 2021 for the 6 groups shown in the 2 panels are generally consistent with increases in excess deaths due to the COVID-19 pandemic. However, the unusually large increase in the age-adjusted death rate shown in panel B for the non-Hispanic American Indian and Alaska Native population cannot be explained by the pandemic, but could very likely be explained by the decline that we saw in the non-Hispanic American Indian by the decline in the non-Hispanic American Indian population. The differences in the changes that we see in panel A and the changes that we see in panel B for the other groups are small by comparison, and which leads us to conclude that of all the populations affected, in addition to the racial groups within the Hispanic population, the American Indian, Alaska Native population was most affected by the changes implemented by the Census Bureau. So now I want to, I guess I don't have a lot of time, so I'll just go very quickly through this. So another area is the potential impact on future studies of the quality of race and ethnicity classification on death certificates. So the practice of using self-reported race on census data as the standard to compare the quality of race reporting on death certificates was implemented beginning with the 1960 decennial census, which is the first census to collect information about race directly from respondents rather than through enumerator observation. The first study to evaluate the quality of race reporting on death certificate was based on the 1960 census death certificate matched record study, which linked 340,000 death certificates to the 1960 decennial census records. Since this study, there has been 5 others that use census data linked to mortality data to evaluate the quality of race reporting on death certificates. This slide shows that the agreement between self-report and what was written on the death certificate for the sample of decedents was excellent for the white and Black populations and the Chinese, Japanese populations, but less so for the American Indian and other races populations. And in the more current period, we have this slide shows again excellent agreement for the non-Hispanic white, the non-Hispanic Black populations, and the Asian and Pacific Islander populations, but not for the American Indian population. We see similarly here for the Hispanic population by country of origin that overall the classification or the agreement is pretty good, but there is considerable variation within the Hispanic population. So one thing I should have mentioned that the reason why we evaluate the quality of race and ethnicity reported on the death certificate is because the death certificate is filled out by the funeral director, or the demographic part of the death certificate is filled out by the funeral director. So it is not, of course, filled out by the respondent. So the funeral director should ask the question of informants of what race and ethnicity the decedent considered him herself to be. A lot of the times that doesn't happen and they rely on observation. And that's where you have the misclassification problem. And so the only way to assess how good that coding or that reporting that the funeral director does is to compare it to what the decedent said while alive. And so that's why the whole idea of self-identification and self-reporting is so important. So the incongruence between census self-reported race and ethnicity and death certificate proxy reported race and ethnicity reflects not only substantive differences in the reporting process, but also differences in how the information is coded, processed, edited. So for example, the US Census Bureau has historically used complex hot deck procedures, and NCHS uses a more simple process of assigning the previous records information. Notwithstanding these differences, to date, the 2 data systems have been highly comparable in the sense that the self-report and the final processed classification are very similar. So basically, one of the concerns is that the recoding elicited, the recording of origin elicited from respondents in the 2020 census race question write-ins into race categories, regardless of which race box the respondent did or did not mark, seriously undermines the meaning of self-identification or self-report. And it is very likely that many 2020 census and ACS respondents did not directly select the race categories they were coded to for self-identification, nor did they have foreknowledge that they would be redefined into the categories they did not select for self-identification. And I'll end it here because I know I'm out of time. So overall, the changes have resulted in significant data discontinuity that has affected demographic and socioeconomic data and analyses that rely on US Census Bureau data, the ability of social scientists, policymakers, and demographers to study racial and ethnic disparities within the Hispanic and American Indian populations and between these populations and other major racial and ethnic groups in this country has been severely constrained by these changes. So to mitigate these effects, methods that bridge race and ethnicity data between pre- and 2020 and post-2020 census data need to be developed and made available to scientists that rely on US Census, on the US Census Bureau data. And that is all. Thank you.